Welcome to the Mick Dark Horror Series. Lights out. Good. Here we go.
For nearly 200 years, MacLennan Castle of Dornie, Scotland, was used to isolate people who had been exposed to diseases like the bubonic plague, Spanish influenza, and smallpox. Countless people died from disease and neglect, living in squalid conditions, and their spirits are said to haunt the now-defunct manor. From the 1830s until 1925, migrant ships arriving in Dornie with suspected contagious diseases were offloaded with passengers and crew into quarantine to protect local residents. The government had provisioned MacLennan Castle as the accommodation. Since it was uninhabited and close to the ports, Toth was now the sole custodian of this somewhat historical landmark. This bizarre and reluctant landmark that, if more alive than it was, would ask to be forgotten. A site of great suffering, misery, and torment. Nick arrived each morning to unlock the gates of the castle. Nick had been under the employment of the castle as its one and only employee, its security guard, for just over 1 month. He was given a briefing on the history of the station and then left to his own devices. The role wasn't that difficult, sitting and keeping an eye on the place so looters and vandals didn't attempt to take any materials or cause damage. So he didn't have to lift a finger, nearly ever. Netflix and earbuds when the connection was substantial enough, and his biggest challenge was staying awake. It was common knowledge by every single person in the Highlands that MacLennan Castle was haunted. It was famous for being so extraordinarily bewitched that this drove tourists in to scout around, en masse, from the outer property. Some paranormal enthusiasts wanted to open it for haunted tours. They felt that this was truly the way to make some real money, and pleaded the case with the Village of Dornie Parks Department, of which authority it resided under. The real value was in its true reputation, being very, very haunted. They knew they could bring in hordes of chill seekers each evening and make a killing. Except they couldn't get the business permit for the evening tours. Dornie felt that the area wasn't a proper or sufficient venue for night tours, and masked it as an ambiguous safety code ruling. Calls to the Village of Dornie licensing body had gone unanswered. This left the castle with one affordable night guard for a place whose history as a depot of conscripted healthcare was dull when contrasted to the stories of haunting from those who suffered under the blanket of redactions of authors. It stopped its role as an operational maritime quarantine facility on the 16th of March, 1925, when ownership of the castle was transferred to a private buyer from the government clutches that were pried only after nearly 100 years and never questioned. Despite considerable work by the new owner over the first 10 years of its ownership as a natural touristic site, much of the castle and the surrounding landscape fell into disrepair. In the past year, the owner could not raise enough funds to stop the decline, and that private sector funding, through more creative and direct use of the castle, was felt not essential enough to ensure long-term conservation. Unfortunately, the castle was no longer safe, and no license could be provisioned to maintain the tourism traffic that had been quite popular. It was a death trap now. The castle was regularly patrolled by village police vehicles because of the amount of thrill-seekers attempting to scale the stone walls and break in. Nick was there to keep it safe in the day, even if he was distracted most of the time. However, he went back home to his wife after 6 p.m. when it became dark. It was November and cold, and there were a few visitors when it was cold, as this, since even if there was no snow, there was still no heating in the castle, except for the gatekeeper partition which housed the curator, director, and the security office. Only one was occupied now, and that was Nick's security office. Nick was unaware of its history. He knew a little, the overarching spooky bits, but he didn't subscribe to that popular nonsense. He was explained more than he could explain by those coming to check the place out and asked to leave. His dad attempted to frighten him with stories about the castle during fishing trips, but he had rubbished these in his mind and passed them off later as being ridiculous attempts at spooking the kid. There was no underlying narrative as to why the castle was abandoned in the last century in the first place. Locals spoke about dead things and madmen, torture and murder. Extraordinary. They would regale you about the human forms that move in the shadows and doors that open and close on their own. Spectre children that play in the halls, but mostly of the moaning that torment the ears and minds of any unfortunate visitor. Historians explained that the castle was simply abandoned due to the death of the family with no heirs. Subsequently, ownership was provisioned to the local government. This was the reason for the use of it, as they liked, for whatever reason they required it. A clear attempt at augmenting the local economy, it was repurposed as a touristic site for those looking to seek out the real Scottish spirit. The antiquity of the castle was beautiful to many, despite falling apart. It represented a living, breathing soul in monument form, emblematic of its Highland culture. Nick was mechanical in his daily oversight and would try to shut down early, as often as possible, when he knew that he wouldn't get caught. He never got caught. There was little to be caught on, to be fair. His responsibility wasn't dire, wasn't important, really. He needed to ensure that no ghost hunters decided to sneak into the castle for a bit of YouTube nonsense, inventing sights and sounds to the ravenous hordes of horror fanatics looking for a chill. Nick was running out of Netflix shows to watch, and that was the most terrifying premise taking place in that castle. He was tired. He hadn't slept well the night before. A horror movie marathon with his friends while his wife was away with her sister in Aberdeen had him up late. He laid his head down on the desk for a few moments. He then raised it up and thought that a cigarette would stimulate him enough to keep awake for the hours to come. From his small office in this giant castle, he decided to walk towards the garden area, which was actually just a former garden, now dilapidated courtyard. He wanted to get some air. So, as he passed through the prefabricated, newer parts that housed the Office of Security and the Curator's office, as well as fairly large storage rooms that was nearly empty other than metal shelves that housed stacks of paper, mostly historical documents pertaining to the castle and permits, certifications, etc. He took a peek in these rooms to provide himself with a sense that he was really doing a bit of extra diligence, all quiet, as expected. Suddenly he felt the urge to walk up the spiral stone staircase to the top of one of the towers. For this, he needed his torch, which was quite dim due to the dying batteries. He had the urge for a view of a nearby town and to see the lights of the town and sneak a cigarette up top, which was quite forbidden in the castle. No smoking permitted anywhere on the property. Who would know? He could crush the butt and sprinkle it out in the wind from up top. As he got to his destination, humming the theme to Game of Thrones, he shook the wooden door until it gave way and opened into the moonlight and cold air, and he walked out onto the stone and the barely 4-meter circumference tower landing. He peered over the ledge, approximately a standard 8 stories up, quite high for a castle. He withdrew a cigarette from the inside pocket of his jacket and zipped it back up quickly with a shiver. It was so much colder up here. Just one and then back to the office. It was far too cold, and almost always was in this ungodly part of the world. Just fortunate that it wasn't raining. After he lit up the cigarette and took a draw from it, exhaling with a slight euphoria, there was a fierce slam. He spun around in absolute shock. The door to the tower had closed on him. Without any further thought, he cursed the wind that must have blew it closed.
Oh, fucking hell. The fuck do I do now?
He didn't wait to be finished, and with the nerves still rattled from the sudden fright, he moved to reopen the door. It wouldn't budge. He yanked at it and felt the door must have become wedged with such a hard slam. He continued to pull at it. Like a child with its head caught in something, he felt the same panic. What if he couldn't get back in and downstairs? The job was the least of his concerns. The night was cold as hell. There was no way he was okay with spending the evening up here with the light security jacket, no scarf or gloves, and the ball cap they made him wear with the security company's name. Tenzin Security was not providing any additional warmth. He gave up pulling at it and started to kick at it. If he couldn't get it open in the most orthodox way, then he'd break it down and explain to the curator in the morning. They'd understand. Now, this door should splinter easily. It was hundreds of years old. Nothing. Just a lot of echoing racket. He'd lose his job, most certainly. If he destroyed even a door on the property, this castle was a UNESCO heritage site. Nick didn't care. He was on top of a tower, trapped outdoors in a light security jacket. It was colder up here than the ground level, and it was really penetrating his bones. He stopped and pivoted around to view his surroundings, to think of how he could get back inside. Was there another door, or could he traverse the wall to the next tower? He'd slip and fall to his death if he even attempted that walk across that narrow stone wall to the next tower, easily 20 meters away. As he panned his surroundings, he was shook with the sight of someone on an adjacent tower, far away on the eastern wing, facing him. Still, but was it a person? Nick couldn't make it out. The wind was frustratingly deafening him. He couldn't distinguish between wind and any other peripheral sounds. He stared at the object across from him that he was certain was a person. He watched to see movement, but it stood still. What he could see, or what he thought he could see, was a female with long, black, flowing hair in a white gown, collar high on her neck, but he couldn't see any facial elements, which is why he couldn't commit to the idea that it was indeed a person. Perhaps it was some debris that blew up and caught one of the non-functioning light poles or the CCTV poles. There was a series of CCTV cameras that were working across the property. Nick knew this because it was his job to watch them. He seen what he thought was debris or fluff flying across the screen at times. Often he thought he saw a shadow or blur walk like a person across parts of the screen, but always attributed this to his perpetual fatigue. Nick was now glaring at this figure across the courtyard, 8 stories up, unwavering. He passed it off as something he couldn't explain, but certainly wasn't a person. Some supplies from recent maintenance was left up there like an upturned mop or rags left behind, etc. But he felt that it already wasted enough of his time. He needed to start figuring out how to get back downstairs. He kicked and kicked the door. It wouldn't give. He threw his body into it, but nothing. This door was solid. He considered trying to climb down to the ground level. There were iron handles all the way down that must have been used for something else back in the 1700s. He figured that since the door was impenetrable, he would fling himself over the ramparts of the tower carefully, begin holding on to the rusted metal handles. If they were to end halfway, Nick wasn't sure if he could carry himself back up. He straddled the wall of the tower and then swung himself over, holding on to the edge, and felt around for the first rusted handle. He found it. He slowly began to lower himself, handle to handle, and was halfway when he couldn't find the next handle. It was not where it should be. Nick became frantic. He felt the ledge that was part of the framing of a deeply inset window of the tower. But he couldn't grab onto it, because there was nothing to grab onto. He was hanging by one arm, kept seeking blindly a metal ring that would allow Nick to grab onto, and lower himself that final 4 stories on the exterior of the tower wall. Each window below this of the descending tower had wrought iron bars protecting each window that were extended out and would likely be easy to grab. But moving from one to the other would be a monumental task for Nick, especially in the dark. When he called out, especially only facing the large courtyard and other towers, pillars of each corner of the courtyard, inner castle perimeter, was nothing more than echoes back to himself. Nobody would hear him. The castle was removed from the city and close to a nearby mire and lake. The mire, or MacLennan Morass, was a wetland joining the lake and the land. His voice merely echoed across the courtyard, bouncing off ancient stone walls and dying slowly across the estuary beyond. Nick's dad used to fish salmon with him nearby. His dad spent some of these trips trying to culture Nick with regaling the history of the area, but ended up creeping Nick out with tales of dead from the turn of the century pandemic. The Spanish flu took millions, and thousands of them perished within these castle walls, while the abandoned castle was used as an offload triage for patients, keeping them isolated from the rest of the area. Very few survived. Nick's dad often joked that one of the skeletons might surface as they passed through the bog. The years that followed had Nick being made aware that these were all jokes, just to get a rise out of the little man. Nick soon believed none of the ghost stories, to the point of silently ridiculing any talk of ghosts or the supernatural. He was one of the only candidates for this current role, security watchman for the castle. This abandoned government-protected heritage site that had little to look at outside of vast empty halls framed by crumbling stone walls, long corridors that were rarely cleaned of webs and dust. A few rooms were strategically fitted with fairly new hospital beds, replicating the old springy metal beds used for the patients of the virus. They were getting rusted now, also from the perpetual moisture in the castle and the ever-present dampness in the air. Nick never understood why any landmark would want to base their tourism appeal on death and the dying. Why they didn't spend any government funding on restoring the castle entirely, and perhaps holding functions there. He was no business genius or academic, but this made sense to him, while he had many hours each day, alone, to think of these things. Now, however, he was battling the chill, and would have no visitors or employee arrive until 10 hours from now, and the premise of a night on the tall tower in the biting wind was a horrifying thought. There was a growing sense, perhaps imagined, that he was not alone. A sense of dread. Something about such a large property. It seemed unfathomable that he could be the one being inhabiting this massive space on the moors. It was senseless, however, as the doors were locked with Nick being the only key bearer, and did his rounds earlier before lockup as the sun was settling. Leaving his mobile phone on the desk wasn't a great idea. He had paused his Netflix episode of Peaky Blinders, left it on the desk for a quick leg stretch. He had never dreamed that he'd be locked out on a tower with a deadly drop below. He could have phoned someone, the castle's director, the curator, his wife, anyone. Nick had no choice but to attempt to descend below, to carefully make it from window grating to window grating, hanging on with frozen numb hands. He pulled himself carefully over the battlement and through the tower embrasure parts. He straddled the stone, seeking the courage to start climbing. One wrong move and he would be crippled or dead below. The other side of the castle, the outer area, had a moat that remained for show, including a bridge across that reached the entrance portcullis. The drop into icy water might still be a better and safer option than climbing down a tower. However, here he was without his imagined option. As it stood at the moment, he needed to swing that foot over, and with a hopeful glance back at the jammed door in the miracle that had become dislodged or unlocked or whatever was wrong with it, he swung that leg over and steadied himself, poised on the raised wrought iron window grill, and carefully turned himself around. The next step was one that was not previously considered or planned. What was he going to hold on to as he attempted to get onto the rung of the top of the window grill? His frozen hands had no real grip on the stone of the battlement, and wouldn't be long before they slipped off. So he had to make a decision, quickly. He did the only thing that was physically possible. Stretched his leg down, feeling for the next rung of the grill. And then a Hail Mary slipped down to grab the top rung that his feet were currently atop of. He braced himself, clutched the embrasure with his right hand in order to stretch as low as he could. Nick's leg kicked around to find that rung, and even though the stretch was further and nervier than he had hoped for, he touched it lightly with his toe to feel where it was so he could reach down quickly for that top rung. And then he made the slide down, grunting in fear and pain to grab onto the grill, holding tightly and losing his cigarettes out of his inner pocket, along with his Zippo lighter, and watching the bright white package fold down to the courtyard. That was it. His heart was pounding, because he now had committed, and come to the realization that there was no way back. It was only down now, 80 feet up in the bitter cold. He clutched tightly and stared down at his cigarette pack. The distance to that white paper box below made him truly think about the distance in that fall. He had now convinced himself that, now that he had a firm bar to grip onto, rather than a slippery stone wall, he would wait a minute before making any next move. He stopped, buried his head into his jacket, and breathed hot air from his lungs into his jacket to try to keep himself warm. As he did this, he heard a strange sound from beneath him, a faint groan that had seemed to have resonated off the walls in a fast-moving echo that ended as quickly as it had begun. He had never heard that sound before, and immediately he processed tugboats or a lorry horn in the distance. No animal from the moors. He didn't think so. It seemed to come from directly underneath him, and as he pulled his head from his jacket and looked down, there was nothing. However, he noticed that his cigarette pack was gone. He disregarded it and subconsciously passed it off as something that mattered little and kept maneuvering his descent. He was only 5 meters or so from the potential drop that he could recover from, he felt. Nick swayed his head side to side, mitigating the next move, and couldn't see one. He immediately had a thought that if he were to somehow pull off his insulated nylon jacket and get it tied to one of the iron bars over the window, he could use it as a rope to slide down to the next window's bars. And once at the furthest point below those, he could drop to the frozen ground below safely enough. This was his only move, and his hands were losing their feeling completely.
Come to us. Please help us.
A distant woman's voice called out, nearly inaudible, contrasting against the freezing wind. This startled Nick, and he immediately felt that this was a trick of the whistling gale. Regardless, his heartbeat increased because he was convinced that he heard every single syllable. Okay, enough. Nick moved himself down further so he could latch his foot onto the lower rebar to position himself to remove his jacket. This would be immensely painful, considering he was already freezing. If this didn't work, and the door below was not unlocked, and as he knew it would have been, he'd be in serious trouble. He was certain that the 2 courtyard doors were unlocked, since he never locked the doors that led to the central exterior of the castle, since there was no access from outside the castle without having to arrive through the main foyer. Besides small locked support staff entrances, formerly castle servant entrances. Nick pulled off his jacket, using his left hand, and using his teeth as well, while his right hand held firmly to the window's bars, and then switched hands and made a knot with the sleeve and yanked it as tight as possible.
Where are you going? Why won't you care for us?
A voice he knew he heard this time. The same woman's voice. She sounded scared, but it was not from any direction. It was all around him. He nearly lost his footing when he heard this. He involuntarily spasmed from shock. He was now most certainly freezing in his white cotton button-up security shirt, so he blocked all fear and started to slide down the nylon jacket. It was gripping tight as he moved down and then looked down to check his distance, and it looked acceptable for a leap. And as he glanced quickly back up, a face was peering over the battlement above. The face was hideous, with mouth agape, in an unnatural moaning expression, and it had no eyes. The face was peering down over the tower, down at him. He couldn't even tell if it were male or female, since the thing's hair was patchy and it was pale and partially transparent, it seemed. This completely freaked out Nick, and without delay, he dropped to the ground below, catching the impact of the frozen ground with his legs, partially bent, and in doing so, popped his left knee, dropping him backwards in pain onto the courtyard grounds.
Oh, fuck!
Clutching his knee, he instinctively glanced back up to the top of the battlement, and the face was there, and slowly slipping back out of view. Nick was now absolutely terrified, because he knew that the voice and the face were very much real. Now he needed to get inside. He tried to lift himself up and found it to be nearly impossible. Attempting to pop his knee back into place was stupid and poorly planned. The movies made it seem so effortless. He let out a scream as soon as he tried.
We are coming. We hear you.
Was a new voice, a deeper male voice. A voice echoed around him. The female voice he subconsciously contemplated had some helplessness with no aggression, pitiful and in need. This last call was sinister and disturbing. This put a spring in his step, albeit painfully. He gripped a stone bench near him and hauled himself off the ground. He grunted and continued to survey his surroundings, still shaking from the cold. The pain in his knee, luckily, was being numbed from the freezing wind. When he thaws out, this will be painful. Nick limped to the courtyard door, and with a firm shove, it opened, and he entered. It was pitch black inside. He shut the door behind him. His thermal jacket was hanging 3 meters above him, so he needed shelter and any warmth he could find. He slowly stumbled inside, leaving the biting cold outside. Now indoors, it was still cold, but without the bluster. It was very dark, and he only saw, prior to the door closing, a moonlit view of a long stone corridor. He knew this corridor well, but it was always lit, at least dimly, but certainly navigable. He spread his arms to the side and shuffling back and forth to identify the walls on each side of him. Touching the cold, damp stones were the tips of his fingers. The corridor was approximately 2.5 meters wide, over a half a meter wider than Nick's arm span. This helped Nick understand the direction that he needed to start in. There was no end to the corridor that Nick could see. It was all enveloped in black. There was no sound except the whisper of biting wind beyond the heavy wooden door behind him. Nick pushed forward at a good pace, walking steadily. He stopped every 10 seconds to check that he was not veering into the wall, and to listen for anything he could. He was put off by the prior voices that were far outside the parameters of sense which irreversibly heightened his alertness. Nick walked, stopped, listened, felt, walked again and repeated until he was halfway, from what his memory offered him from his routine security walkthroughs. If only he had not been so lazy as to spurn the majority of his compulsory checks, resorting to more naps, mobile phone games, and Netflix. He should know the castle better. Over 80 rooms, a dozen large halls where the sick and dying were treated, over a century ago, and countless corridors, old winding stone and mortar stairwells, across 6 floors of height, weaving a maze throughout the property, encircling the outdoor courtyard as its centerpiece. With its unused fountains and sometimes manicured shrubberies. Nick took his next few steps, with the assumption that he was nearing the end. Now feeling forward to touch anything ahead to end his journey. As he took a step forward, he heard the door, approximately 20 meters behind him, causing a slow creaking sound and pouring the cold wind into the hallway. He had shut this door tightly and firmly. This he remembered. As it opened, the dimmest of illumination also peeked through, outlining a figure at the end of the hall. It was nearly impossible to get a precise view due to his limited sight, but there was what seemed to be a person standing at the end of the hall, in front of the open door. Barely noticeable, with long hair fluttering in the wind. Nick didn't consider friend nor foe. He simply ran. He dragged his arm along one wall while running towards the end that was still pitch black, and then tripped and barreled onto the floor, causing no real damage outside of scaring him. He pulled himself up, holding his knees, and immediately gazed down the hall. Door still open. No figure apparent. Every molecule in his body assumed that this figure was now somewhere in that stretch of black that was not illuminated, and that he needed to move. He felt around for the stairs that he knew were there somewhere. He bumped the first step with his foot, and that was it. He started jogging slowly, navigating the twist of each step upward. As he reached the top of the windowless staircase, when he felt no further ascent, and he knew he was at the first floor foyer, still immersed in the opaque. He heard footsteps below him, seemingly ascending the stairs. With his heart smashing in his chest, he turned to go further upstairs to seek light anywhere. That idea was crushed when he also heard steps descending from above him. He took flight in the opposite direction of the original ground level approach on that second floor, and tried the doors on that level. Swiftly sprinting down the hall with arms outstretched, slowing down, Nick stopped to listen. No sound. Nothing. He creeped forward, still listening, and found the end where he banged into a door ahead of him. He felt for the handle. Nick not caring if it were open, because he wanted only his lit-up security office. His phone was there, and coat, and he was still freezing. There was a jumper in his locker next to the security room. He had just no real idea how to get there. He was now lost. Again, Nick vented to himself for not knowing his way around the castle as much as someone that was hired to know their way around should. Nick Toth needed to find some light. He was in complete darkness everywhere. As he stopped, there was movement around him, but it was distant and everywhere. The most basic sound of presence, walking, and voices, slight moaning. Nick felt immense frustration with not knowing his location.
Thank Nick. Jesus Christ, thank. You are in the east wing of the courtyard. Enter through the east servant entrance into the courtyard. So where are you now? You need to get to the office. That's back on the ground floor, but you know you can't go back down there. Not yet. Not until it's safe.
Nick walked slowly down the dark hallway. He stopped at each door that he felt along the wall. He hesitated each time to try to open them, because he knew fully well that they would be as dark as this corridor, and perhaps more so. That didn't stop Nick from stopping at one of the doors when he heard... What was that? Moaning. Someone in pain. He knew that nobody was in the castle except for him. Nick put his ear flush against the door and listened. He placed his hands against the door to hold his weight as he listened in. Suddenly, Nick's weight forced the door open unexpectedly. He would have thought they'd all be locked. That is when the moan became a scream that pierced his brain and startled him to run. Picking himself up and running down a hall, scraping his fingertips on the wall. The scream faded behind him in that room. while he knew that there would be something in this pitch dark that he was going to slam into. Luckily, Nick felt a curve on the wall that indicated the battlement tower interior, and he knew that he had to stop or risk plummeting down a set of stone stairs. When he did get there, he felt his foot around to the step and then started to move upstairs. Ghosts be damned. He needed to get to that north corner of the castle because he knew he couldn't go back down. Not yet. That image, that silhouette, looming, was most certainly not a fabrication. Perhaps also not of this world. But either way, it was here, somewhere. It could have made its way upstairs, in with the moaning, screaming, pleads for help that wisped through the air all around him. Occasionally, he was ready to shut it down and go home as soon as he could get to the office and get his keys that would let him out and into his car and into his home. He was desperate. He was cold, fatigued, and very much afraid. When Nick made his way slowly to the bottom of the stairs, he stopped and listened. The sound of water dropping from the old pipes running through the corridor. He could see a light coming from the door on the end, which illuminated the corridor slightly. What light was this? He wondered. He didn't know the door. An entrance from outside? Again, Nick rarely made his rounds. He knew he didn't have to, so at best he would walk to the front gate for a smoke. He was now spun around. Could only assume that he was looking at the upper exterior mezzanine, as they now called it. But a one-time upper garden area that was now a stone terrace that they kept old junk on, since nobody was allowed up there. Again, the outside was illuminated by more than just moonlight, but he was happy for some light. A respite from the pitch black he had been bathing in for the past 2 hours or so. There was still a spot of black that the partially open door shadowed from behind. And from that, he saw movement. Something leaving the shadow from behind that large wooden door. He heard it now. It was metal creaking sound, and the sound of something similar to rollers on the stone floor. Like a shopping cart sound, but more squeaky. It moved from the black, and Nick could see that this thing rolling towards him was a gurney. A very old gurney that was sliding slowly down the hall towards Nick. He couldn't understand what was powering this. Then the light went out completely, and he was again enveloped in the darkness. But the sound of this thing getting closer freaked him out to the point of another dash upstairs. This time, he knew he had his limit, because there was only one floor left upstairs, and that was blocked by a wooden hatch, locked with a padlock. This was an attic area across each of the 4 sides of the castle, but used for keeping old furniture when they were replaced with replicas that were not falling apart. This is where dozens of those old gurneys, much like the one he had just seen, it was stored from the days of the pandemic, where so many perished within these walls, laying on those same gurneys. Once he reached the top of the stairs, he heard the rolling gurney below hit the end of the hall with a loud impact that rang through the castle corridors. Here he was again, back at the top level, where he had gone for his first cigarette. All of this to be stuck once again at the highest level. the last stop that was accessible. He was on the opposite side of the castle now, as he calculated. Above him, the storage floor of old, creepy things. Items that would have been sweated into and bled over 100 years ago by skeletal patients quickly retreating from life, with the expectation that they came on ships to be cared for, yet were only isolated until they could expire. Nick knew this fact from his father. His father's father used to work as a deckhand on one of these boats, carrying the sick. Crude burlap masks over face in the belly of these boats, and shipped into this abandoned castle as a collective tomb, and then burned in the courtyard, away from peering eyes. Everyone, however, knew it was the stuff of creepy lore for decades. Hence, the desire of the ghost seekers and the paranormal investigators to get into the castle repeatedly. They never allowed visitors at night, so nobody, except Nick, ever experienced MacLennan Castle after dark. Of course, the daytime was of no interest to the ghost hunters. It was now evident why. Nick walked upstairs. There was one small port window that existed at this level, at the top of the stairs, within the circular stairwell. Each step he was enveloped in the sound of water dripping, his heartbeat, and the outside sound of the biting wind whistling through the ramparts. His tension was palpable. His senses were on high alert, and he was cold. The numbness of his fingers and toes were growing. He knew that his trip to the top floor was not strategic. It wasn't his way out. But every floor, up until now, has seen things that are clearly aware of his existence and stalking him. Nick was not a horror film fool, searching out mysterious sounds and assessing visions. When he saw anything or heard anything that stopped his heart, he got the hell out of there. Now, he was at the end of his tether. He had no way out, except up the ladder to the opposite tower, outside into the damp, freezing Scottish cold, where it could be locked out again, or back downstairs, through the apparitions, man-hunting gurneys, and cries and moans of MacLennan Castle. He wished he had those cigarettes now. A wee ciggy would be just the thing to calm his nerves. That or a swig of whiskey. As he stood at the top of the stairs, in the dark, trying to control his heartbeat, then he heard it. It nearly ended him. Wailing and shuffling feet above him, followed by rolling gurneys and thuds. It was kicking off upstairs. As he turned to the stairs to flee, the stairs were not there. It was a solid wall. He felt around. Surely he had just moved off his positioning, but after searching every conceivable space, he was dumbfounded. He was blocked in, somehow. Then those sounds drew around him. He was amidst them. He recoiled into a squatting fetal position, covering his ears. Eyes closed or open. It was the same opaque view. Suddenly, something, a hand, touched his head and brushed through his hair. A small hand, whimpering.
Why won't you help us?
Nick screamed and fell to the floor, shaking. He heard the squeaking of metal and rusted wheels passing around him on the floor, making him crazy. The cacophony was deafening. Quickly, it subsided to silence. He was shivering on the floor, awaiting the worst, and when the silence came, he uncovered his ears and cautiously stood up and opened his eyes. Nick found himself covering his eyes. A glaring light surrounded him, and it was blinding. He had been in total darkness since he entered the castle from outside, and the sudden presence of light hurt his eyes. He slowly acclimatized himself to the light and saw that he was in his office, security desk in front of him. He had been seated. Had he been dreaming? He was startled and in disbelief and caring less about how he arrived at his office and more about leaving. He felt the lines on his face, like imprints from napping into his arms. Yes, it was a dream. He had fallen asleep at his desk. He was certain of it. It was all a bad dream. It makes sense now. Now he really needed that cigarette. But his cigarettes were in his jacket. And as Nick shivered, teeth chattering, he realized that his jacket was nowhere to be found.